Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, sponsored by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm host Randy Johnston with my co-host Brian Tankersley, and we are pleased to talk to you about the Reader's Choice Awards that have been done annually by the CPA Practice Advisor for 21 years. Editor Isaac O'Banion's run this survey, and he states in his article, it's not a scientific survey, but more of a measure of the enthusiasm of products advocates. And we frankly think it's a reflection of firm size and products currently in use. The main thing we'd like you to learn is that it's worth going back to look at the article that Isaac has written, but we thought in podcast form we could cover a lot of products in a hurry. So Brian, I think if I can get you started with the first category here, I think we'll step through these categories fairly quickly, but the first one up is federal and state income tax prep.
Yeah, Randy, and as you know, as you've said often, accountants switch tax software about as often as they switch major world religions. So it's not a surprise that Drake Software won again this year with 58%. Next was Intuit Lacert Pro Series or Pro Connect at 15%, TaxAct Prepares Edition at 5.25%, Wolters Kluwer CCH Access CCH Pro System FX Tax at 4.8%, and then Thomson Solutions at 4.8%.
Yes. So in the big picture of things, the tax software has not changed much over the past year. Now, income tax planning actually has changed a little bit. You and I looked at the BNA tax planner of this year, which the AI modifications were quite stunning. But on income tax planning, Drake Tax Planner came in at 58%, and the Intuit Lacert Tax Planner or Tax Advisor for ProConnect at about 15%. Now, we know Intuit doesn't intend to support that in the long haul, so that'll be dropping off in the future. Now, Jackie Meyer over Tax Plan IQ has picked up to 5%. The Planner CS platform from Thomson Reuters is at 5%, and ProSystem Planning is about 5%. Now, other advanced tools like Corvi didn't show up in the final list, although they are in this survey.
And notice that BNA didn't show up either.
Yeah, and it did in the extended results, which, folks, is why we really want you to take a look at the article itself. But I think next up might be specialty systems and tax prep tools.
So, yeah, and in this category, we had Gruntworks at 28%. Again, a scan, organize, and populate tool. QuickBooks Self-Employed at 21%. CCH Access and ProSystem FX from Wolters Kluwer. I'm not sure which ones they're referring to there, but 7.7%. Avalara 1099 and Debbie 9 at 7.3%, and SafeSend at 5.9%.
Yeah, so now there were other extended products here too, the SurePrep product and others, Canopy, for example. So there's a lot of specialty systems and tax prep tools that are also named. But that does bring us then to tax accounting research. And here, an interesting blend of materials, the tax book, tax materials at 48%, and QuickFinder tax handbooks at 10%. Then Intuit's always had a really nice offer with their tax research, 6%, Thomson Reuters Checkpoint at 6%, and Tax Speaker at 6%. So the other competitors, the CCH IntelliConnect, AnswerConnect, and so forth, Bloomberg and others are in the extended list. So that brings us to tax document automation.
Yeah, so for number one there, we ended up with TaxDome at 39%, followed by Gruntworks Populate. Intuit Tax Import for Lacert ProConnect and Pro Series at 12%. Wolters Kluwer CCH iFirm or ProSystem FX Scan at 5%. And Thomson Reuters Source Document Processing and Workpaper CS at 3.6%.
So when we looked at some of the extended products, the SurePreps, the RoboForms 1040 and whatnot, I think this reflected probably the level of sophistication of products being used. And that rolled us over then to sales and use tax. Now here, there are so many players. Avalara came in at 19 and CFS tax at 14%, SureTax at 12.3%, OneSource from Thomson Reuters at 8%, and e-file sales tax at 8%. but other products were nipping the heels. TaxJar at 8.1 and Vertex at 3.5 and Sovos at 1.6. There's other very sophisticated systems that did not make it even named, but the others category here was quite large at 15%. So we're going to watch this evolve with Tax and others. And that brings us to sales tax exemption certificate management.
Yeah, and so with their Thomson Reuters One Source came out on top there at 32.5%, followed by Avalara Cert Capture at 21%, Vertex Exemption Certificate Manager at 15%, Sovos at 13.6, and then a very large others at 17.8. And I don't think there was much of anything else. I don't think there were any others listed in that. So this was a fairly thin category as far as competitors.
It was fairly thin, and that gets us to write-up. Now, of course, write-up is less popular today with interactive accounting, but the QuickBooks Accountant Edition came in winner here at 47%, Drake Accounting at 23.5. I think justified there. Xero at 6%, Thomson Reuters Accounting CS is still popular at 4%, and Sage Intacct or Sage One at 3.3. The Accounting Power product was only at 1.7%, which we thought might be low. The Accounting Suite product, which is now called Custom Books, was also at 1% in this particular category, and about 11% in the other category. So for audit engagement tools, oh my, what a lot of change going on here.
Yeah. So with that one, Audit File is in here at 49%. Thomson Reuters Workpaper CS, Advanced Flow, or Checkpoint Smart Audit Suite, 8.6%. The CCH list, 7.5%, SureLink, 5%, and Caseware Idea, 4%. One thing I would say here is that the audience for this pub, the percentage that do audits is relatively small. So, and again, the firms are typically a little smaller too. So it's this is one where I don't know that I have any great insight to say other than this is not something that everybody in this survey would do.
Yeah, in fact, I would have favored more PCR, but OnPoint PCR only came in at 1.3, just like the DAS from CPA.com came in at 1.2. But interesting enough, Teammate Analytics came in at 1.2, which was a much higher end product.
Yeah, go figure.
So they were kind of all over the map. Now, I had the good pleasure of interviewing a brilliant team of business valuation specialists this past week. And we did talk about how so many people use Excel sheets here, but the products in this category, SageWorks Valuation Solution came in at 29.9, the Value Source Pro out of Colorado at 20%, Value Adder at 17%, MoneySoft Valuation Pro at 17%, and all the others at 15.5. There are a number of valuation products, and different products fit different certifications better. And that brings us to...
And they fit different problems better.
Different problems better. Absolutely right, Brian. So that brings us to fixed asset management.
And there we have the Intuit Pro Series, Lacert Pro Connect Fixed Asset Manager at 25%, Thomson's Fixed Asset CS at 21%, CCH Fixed Asset Manager or Pro System FX Fixed Assets 13.6%, Drake at 6.6%, and 5.8% for ProWare Asset Keeper.
And so one of the interesting things I thought here, Brian, was that the Sage fixed assets just dropped at 5.7, so 1/10 of a point off the list, but Traverse was still in there and WASP was still in there, for example. But when everything's said and done, it's pretty clear that with the Intuit fixed asset and Thomson fixed assets, those two are going to dominate the market. One concern we have is no fixed asset product being delivered as a SaaS tool right now. The only one we're aware of that's common is BNA. So this will be a soft underbelly of the profession for quite a little while.
Yeah, the other thing there that surprised me was to see Drake hit 6.6 here and yet 58% on the income tax prep. So that's a kind of an interesting combination.
Yeah, a very odd anomaly, isn't it? So payroll solutions.
Yeah, payroll solutions, we have QuickBooks Payroll at 22%, Drake Accounting at 17.5%, ADP at 13.7%, Gusto at 12% with all those relationships they have with different cloud companies, and Paychex at 4.6%.
So most of the rest of the players here on payroll were all at 3% or less. Payroll Relief, the MyPay families, the Sage 50s, and Sure Payrolls, and OnPays and Patriots, all had relatively small listings. But the key thing of note here is there were over 20 additional vendors in the other category. So that's really telling me that there is no super dominant payroll provider out there, even though these numbers, have some 20% to them. There's lots of opportunity in payroll. So that brings us over to the 1099 W-2 compliance. And again, so many competitors here.
So Drake Accounting came in at 22%, eFile for Biz at 9.8%, CFS Tax Solutions at 7%, Track 1099 at 6.5%, and Tax 1099 at 4.2%. I'm a big fan of these. I really like I like the ability to just input these things and then to have the, the mail fairy just take them away and put them into somebody's mailbox.
Yeah. And as it turns out, I've used 3 of the products that were in the top 5 winners. Again, for my tastes, I just vary. But, the next products below Tax 1099 were all kind of 3% type players. So there's another 5 or 6 there. So when you look at the article that Isaac prepared, you're going to find there's almost 20 products in that category. Further, the other category had another 15. So I don't know. Does that mean there's close to 50? That's probably
well, I think it just gives us a new definition for what fragmented really means. So
yeah. So that brings us to time and billing.
Yeah, so with time and billing, TaxDome came in at 36%. Evidently, they got a lot of fans in the reader base. QuickBooks Time at 16%, Carbon at 9.2%, Bill at 5%, and Sage Time Slips at 2.9%. I don't know that I've seen time and billing in Bill, but great. I'm glad they have it.
Not sure how that happened, but TPS software came in at 2.6 and Canopy at 2.3. So again, quite a number of players in this particular space. And that rolls us over to practice management, which had similar results with TaxDome at 48, Carbon at 11, the CCH family at 6.6, tied with Thomson Reuters at 6.6, and Office Tools, who's been around for a bit, at 4.3. Now, it turns out that Canopy's base must have just been kind of flying under the radar here, because they were at 3.9 and Financial Sense was at 2.4, and Mango was still holding its own even here at 1%. But that then leads us over to another part of this, the online invoicing and bill payment solutions. Now here, the list was pretty lengthy again.
So again, TaxDome at 29%, Intuit Payments at 20%, Carbon at 7%, Bill at 6.5%, and CPA Charge at 6.3%. But again, you've got a ton of other folks in there. PayPal, Xero, Invoiced, Office Tools, Drake, Bill and Pay, Square, Zoho Books, FreshBooks, and then the other is 10% there at the end.
Yeah. So that brings
very fragmented.
Very fragmented. So that brings us to client portals. And here, talk about fragmentation. The number, Brian, that I've quoted to our listeners in the past, 89 portals I'm tracking right now. And I'm just sure I'm going to find another one. It's like every time I turn around, oops, there's another one. But here we have Drake software portals at 33%. That makes sense with the platform on the tax prep earlier. TaxDome at 29, Carbon at 5.6, Dropbox at 3.7. That makes sense strategy-wise, and Verifile at 3.1. But here, legacy players like ShareFile are at 2.9, and Canopy's here as well. But then you've got NetClient CS and all the CCH ones and the Smart Vaults and so forth. So just remember, 89 tells you we got fragmentation. And that brings us over to document management and storage. Now here, my numbers are probably a little smaller than represented by the respondents in the survey. So, Brian, how did this one come out?
So Drake Document Manager at 39%, TaxDome at 28%, Carbon at 5.5%, Pro Series Lacert or Pro Connect Document Management at 4%, a TR File Cabinet CS and Go File Room at 3%.
Yeah, and so just below them was CCH Access Document at 2.9 and Smart Vault down below that. So, when we look at these players, we're going to see a lot more replacements because many of these are, getting some age. I think the one that got the most upgrade didn't make it to the top 5 list here, which was Smart Vault during this past year. And SureLink also has some pretty radical updates that are happening to it. But I probably would have put SureVault over in the portal unless here in the document management, document storage area.
Okay, so next one is other document management tools, and this is really looking more at the image enhancement and so forth, but it's got Fujitsu at 29%, HP at 23%, Canon at 11%, Kofax at 6.2%, and Abby at 6%. Just kind of most of these are kind of bundled with the scanner as you buy them. Most of these are not things that you would necessarily buy on a standalone basis in most cases. So people know what they know, and they may not know anything different.
And speaking of know what you know, remember that Fujitsu is now owned by Ricoh, so that's really probably a better name there. Further, other tools like CPAPA, now owned by Thomson Reuters, and Nuance were also in the list. But think of these as utilities. And really, I think the key learning here is you've got a combination of Ricoh, HP, and Canon battling it out for the scanner near and dear to the heart.
Yeah, so the next thing we have then are comprehensive firm workflow systems, and TaxDome comes in at 59%, followed by Carbon at 11.5%. Thomson Reuters FirmFlow or Practice CS Project Management are 6.5%. CCH Access Workstream or iFirm are 5.9%. Financial Sense at 2%. Okay. And there are some others in there, but XCM showed up in there, Pascal Workflow, Autonomy, which is, that's one that fits at the really super high end. So it's an interesting combination.
Yeah. And, Brian, you and I had visited the Count CEO in December, and I have noted a few wins for that vendor as of late. So we'll see how that all plays out. But then the other workflow tools is a combination of a variety of things.
Yeah. So we got TaxDome at 36%, Gruntworks at 12%, Carbon at 8%, Intuit Tax Advisor for Lacert and Pro Connect Tax at 4.8%, and then Bill at 4.3%.
So from there, it went to, various CCH systems and Thomson Reuters systems and Office Tools and ShareFile and on and on and on. Again, a pretty lengthy list of maybe about 20 players in that space. So that led us to the website builders and services. Now, here, the list was actually not bad in terms of its length, about a dozen, but there are way more than the dozen that were named, and the others did not classify. Isaac did not report all of the extra website builders. So here we have TaxDome at 18%, Drake Software SiteDart at 18%, GetNet Set at 15%, CPA Site Solutions at 10%, which, by the way, used to be a very large provider, and CCH Site Builder at 5%. And that's about where they had been. I was pleased to see some of the other web building softwares, but we do caution you to be thoughtful about your website presence, because even the sites that my NMGI team have built can use updating on a regular basis.
Yeah. Okay, next one is favorite CPE provider. CPAPA was number one at 19%, Drake at 16%, CPA Academy at 9%, AICPA at 8%, and State CPA Societies at 5.5%. Kind of disappointed that K2 is not in there, but since we sell most of our stuff wholesale to the state CPA societies, I guess we have to take the W on that fifth one there, Randy.
Yeah, that's probably pretty close to where it's at. And I am pleased that our listeners are participating in CPA Practice Advisor, CPE, and frankly, probably in AI CPA town halls as well to pick up CPE because that indicated elsewhere. But in terms of the medium, live online classes has now peaked out or is now over 50%. That's what I was really trying to say. 52.8, self-study with test at 25, in-person seminars and webinars at 20, and all others is only 2.4. So relatively small number there. And then it came to the conferences.
Yeah, so ASCPA Engage came in there at 18.8%, IRS tax forms at 14%, QuickBooks Connect at 7.5%, NAEA National Conference at 3%, and then Digital CPA at 2.9. A lot of great opportunities in that segment. It's just a matter of figuring out what you're trying to accomplish and then figuring out where you want to go based on that.
Yeah, and some of the ones that didn't make it to the top 5, the Scaling New Heights event with Joe Woodard, Gail's CPA Practice Advisor Ensuring Success, which you and I spoke at last December, the CCH User Conference and the Synergy Conference, which we've recorded podcasts on, and we've both had the pleasure of attending those through the years. But wow, 38% of other events, and I suspect a good number of those might be state level events.
Yeah, and again, the other hard part about this year is that there are different tracks here. Sometimes folks want to do the IRS shows. Sometimes they want to do, if they're CPAs, they may want to do the AI CPA stuff because they've got to do some peer review stuff maybe that they can get there. On the other hand, if you're an EA and you're doing this primarily for tax, then you almost have to go to those events because it's got to be very tax focused to qualify as IRS CPE. So, again, it's pretty fragmented as we would expect. Now, an area that's not fragmented is desktop small business accounting. With QuickBooks Desktop at 78%, it's the Walking Dead one, Randy. It's
800-pound gorilla.
Yeah, it's the Walking Dead 800-pound gorilla that's not dead yet, but is again, they're trying to kill it pretty hard. PC software accounting at 4%, Drake at 2%, A Systems Visual Bookkeeper at 1.7%, and then Checkmark Software Multi-Ledger at 1.7%.
Yeah, and many of the other players there were kind of small players, but it is clear the transition is happening into SaaS and online business accounting. Yeah. And not a surprise here also, the 800-pound gorilla was QuickBooks Online, with Xero coming in at 66%, with Xero coming in at 7.9%, Thomson Reuters products at 3.2%, Intact at 2.8%, and Wave at 2.5%. Up and comers included Zoho Books and FreshBooks, and there were some other, good products in that particular category. Now, I know, Brian, you got to write one of the things that you've been wanting to write for years as a CPE course for our K2 group this year, and that was expense and travel management.
Yeah,
And so as it turns out, the expense and travel management, Expensify came in at 22%. The runners up there was Zoho Expense at 9.7%, Dext had 7.5%, Concur Expense 6.5%, Tally at 6.2%, and then many others from there. But I knew that was one that was really near and dear to your heart. But that then brings us over to the retail accounting point of sale system.
And give me 1 second because I somehow missed that one. I think I pulled that one out. But looking at this though, retail accounting and point of sale, again, Square ends up at 37%, Intuit QuickBooks POS 35%, NetSuite OnSite POS 3.1%, then AccuPause and Radiant Systems Counterpoint. The interesting part about this to me is that when Intuit shed the QuickBooks point of sale product and stopped supporting it, so that's 24% that's not supported anymore. The interesting part was they tried to send everybody over to Shopify, which didn't show up on the list. So
yeah, that is a superb observation because the Shopify transitions, some went well, some didn't. but for it not to appear on the list at all is surprising.
Not of a surprise. Yeah. Yeah. So ASP and hosting providers, RightWorks, which actually owns CPA Practice Advisor, ended up at 29.7%. CTROM ended up at 14%. Ace Cloud at about 14%. Thomson Reuters Virtual Office at 11%. And then Private Cloud and Cloud9 Real-Time by Carrot, which is, again, the group out of San Diego at 4%. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, outsourced tech services, RightWorks at 34%, CTROM at 15%, Ace Cloud at 14.6%, NMGI showing up at 5%, and then Callbox at 4.7%. Anyway.
So it is interesting to see the technology providers, showing up where they do. And likewise, maybe the technology we covered earlier, the HP Brother Canon Fujitsu / Ricoh Epson is probably more definitive of the actual hardware used for scanning.
And I would say from a printer perspective, I've been very happy with my Brother printers for many years, and they've served me very well. Again, the Fujitsu scanners now have been replaced by Ricoh, like we mentioned earlier. But, again, it's interesting that that's there.
Yeah. So I think then you are probably best served to talk about the next one, the favorite form of physical exercise during tax season.
Yeah. And number one is what you'd expect it to be. Who has time to exercise during busy season? The accountant equivalent of get the heck off of my lawn at 41%. Weightlifting at 8.5%, picking up those heavy binders and client records, those big heavy tax returns you had to print out for them. Walking at 8%, jogging and running away from situations at 7%, yoga at 6.9%, and wrapping up with jumping to conclusions at 6.4%.
And now I think, Brian, if we'd have taken all 6 of those and put them in the office, I think walking between offices, jogging and running between offices, and doing a little yoga while in the office.
Yeah, I'm surprised, and for some people, I'm surprised we didn't end up with aerobic swearing showing up, so.
Well, Brian, whenever I see the Reader's Choice Awards from either Isaac at CPA Practice Advisor or other sources, for me, it's always an opportunity to learn about new products. And there are some new products on the list that we will be covering in future accounting technology labs. So any particular parting thoughts for you today, Brian?
I'm with you on that, in that I think it's interesting to see what people choose in here, because again, there aren't that many folks that know the whole market. And so the thing I would say about that is that helps you understand what people are actually using everywhere and what they're excited about, honestly. Again, this is almost like it is a popularity contest almost. So, as we're looking at it here, this kind of helps us, that are, you and I, the way I think about it here is that this is the equivalent of the ratings, and you and I are the equivalent of the critics, when it comes to drama and plays and things like that. I know your daughter and son-in-law work on Broadway. And so as I look at this, I think the critics have a role, and I think the people's choice has a role, again, and I think at the end of the day, pick what you like, live your life, be happy, and hopefully it gives you some insights here.
So you want me to break out in song with popular? I want to be
You want to be popular.
You got it.
Very good.
In any case, we appreciate you listening to Brian and I today. Hopefully you at least got a little bit of insights of who won what in the Reader's Choice this year. We'll talk to you again soon in another accounting technology lab. Good day.
Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.